Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you all doing very well wherever you are in the world. Once again, please continue to take very good care of yourselves. Stay strong, stay safe, and stay healthy, and be well as always, my friends. And I would like to continue with the Q&A. And so now, by my count, we are at Q&A Part 8. The video where a number of people have very kindly left behind questions for me to answer, and so I'm going to pick up where I last left off. And so now I have a question from our dear friend JR62. Hello, my friend, and you ask, "Hi Daisuke, I would like to hear your take on genres in cinema. It seems that some art house fans will refer to genre films as though they are less than art house films. I think art house films are a genre also. A lot of films are multiple genre mixes. I think the term genre in film may be going away or reduced to many subgenres. What do you think? Cheers." Okay, that's a very interesting question, and I think I might have addressed a similar question in a previous Q&A. Maybe it was the first one, I think. And I was talking about how I was talking about something similar, and I suppose the one thing I could add to this is I don't know necessarily if genres or the use of genres when talking about or explaining a particular film or a set of films. I'm not sure if the use of genres itself will go away anytime soon. Perhaps there will be different types of genres that will emerge, but I think the genres that we know now will remain. We've seen this, I think, in other art forms. Literature, etc., and music, etc. And so I think I think genres as a means or tools to express or explain those films that we talk about in the film community spheres, I think those will pretty much stay the same. But I do also acknowledge what I think you're alluding to very astutely, which is this idea of subgenres, or maybe the formation of different genres, or maybe, to put it a different way, the use of different terminology to express similar types of genres, especially where genres are mixed, as you suggest. And I think we've already beginning to see that, or we have seen that in the cinematic past, and I'm sure it will continue going forward. And you mentioned this comment, which let me repeat, which says, "It seems that some art house fans will refer to genre films as though they are less than art house films." And I mean, this is, I think, something that is, I think it really depends on who one is talking to. And even if one comes across someone who considers, let's say, let's use the phrase art house films, to be better than, let's say, a mainstream summer blockbuster or something like that. I mean, that's just the way some people view cinema. And the way that some people view cinema doesn't necessarily have to match with the way other people view cinema. I mean, they could be the same, they could be different. It really depends on what you are looking for in your own particular journey. And I think I might have mentioned this in the past Q&A, but cinema is so vast and so wide an ocean that it is almost impossible. It is impossible to try to establish one way in which one needs to appreciate cinema. In other words, it's so vast that there are so many different avenues available to oneself, such that if you or anyone, I don't mean you specifically, but if one decides that yes, many different genres are, let's say, what I like, then I think that's great. If there are others who view certain art house films to be the genre or the group of films that one prefers over others. I think that's perfectly legitimate as well. And even if people might, let's say, disparage or put down certain genres, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. I mean, one of the things about art and about cinema is this idea of engaging with it both in a positive reaction and a negative reaction. And I think the whole point of that is when we're in this film community, this sphere of different voices, which I think come together. Sometimes there are disagreements, and other times there are agreements. I mean, that's just the nature of things. But I think that's one of the interesting things about cinema, at least from my point of view, which is that even if there are strong voices that disagree with something that I might say or something that I might believe in, I think I always take that to be a really good test for me in terms of, do I really love the film the way that I say I do, or am I just saying that? And if I feel like I am maybe my position is diminishing because of certain voices of disagreement, then maybe that says more about how I truly feel about the film than anything else. And so I always took disagreements to be very not only healthy but also very helpful for me, because they always help me to test myself and really test the true nature of my own, let's say, cinematic fortitude, let me put it that way. And so even if there are voices out there or viewpoints out there of people, and maybe people that we are friends with and people that we really trust in terms of cinematic tastes, even if there are voices even from those circles that might suggest that the genres that we like might be of, let's say, lesser value than other genres, really just that's just the way things are. And I think we can also take that as a great opportunity to really just test our love of that genre. And if we still love that genre even after all that, then I think that really says a lot about our own enthusiasm and our own passion for that particular thing or aspect of cinema. So I think there are many different voices, many different viewpoints, many different journeys through this wide, vast expanse of a terrain which is called cinema. And so and I think also that lends itself very nicely to the other point you were making about how there are possibly many different ways to describe new things that are emerging, this notion of subgenres which you mentioned. And so I think you mentioned something that is still very prevalent, still very something that is just part of not just our discussions of cinema, but our discussions of any aspect of our daily lives. And so it's just a matter of how we come away from those conversations. I mean, do we come away from those conversations feeling even more proud or even prouder about our love of a particular film or a particular genre? And if so, I think I mean those conversations really came through in the end. So but yeah, I think this stuff is very natural for any kind of fan community, be it cinema or otherwise. So I think what you're saying is really on point. So thank you very much, JR62, for a wonderful question or set of questions. I really appreciate it. Next we have director Ryrie. Please accept my apologies if I mispronounce that. But Director Ryrie says, "Thank you, Daisuke, for lending us all the opportunity to ask you some questions for your Q&A. I have a few that I think should be interesting enough to promote some discussion." Okay, well, I'm all for that. So let's see what you have to say. So number one, some auteurs have such a strong signature stamp on their work that means anyone reasonably aware of their style will be able to figure out blank directed blank, okay, in a matter of minutes. Can you name some directors whom you believe have this ability and try to hypothesize what makes their work so singular and noticeable? Oh gosh, that's a very, very deep, profound question. So thank you very much for that. And that's only the first of many, so that's great. So I wish I had more time, but if I could mention many directors, and I think it could go on and on and on for hours. But if I could just save my comments for just one director, if you don't mind. And I think this, again, could be applied to just about anyone who has a real powerful voice in cinema that we all know. But I think one that comes to mind right now, as an example anyway, is perhaps the French director, Robert Bresson. I'm a great admirer of the works of Bresson. I really love his works. I've seen them many times, a number of them, quite a number of times actually, and I just have a real sort of a profound sense of almost a cathartic feeling after watching many of his works. And if you'll permit me, and I'm trying to answer this last part of this really great first question, which is try to hypothesize what makes their work so singular and noticeable. So if I were to apply this to the example that I raised of Robert Bresson, I would say something like, there is a certain element of, the phrase minimalism is used a lot, I think, when describing Bresson's work, and I think very reasonably so. But if I could try to add to that, or just try to explain it in my own words perhaps, it might be something like, maybe it's almost like with a Bresson film, within the frame itself, he is just as concerned with the space between characters, or the space among characters, just as he is as concerned with the characters themselves and their own processes and struggles and issues of faith or crises in faith, etc. So just as much as he is concerned with the characters themselves and their actions and their motivations, I think Bresson is also equally as concerned with the space between and among characters. And I mean that in many respects. First, there is a sense of the physical space that exists between the characters, and we see this in framing, we see this in the way the characters move, and they move in concert with each other or in contradiction with each other, but there's a certain elegance or grace in the movements. But also, it's almost like a spiritual or a thematic or an emotional kind of bond, or something that exists in the space. And I think that extends beyond the frame itself to the space that exists between the viewer and the events of the film, or the characters of the film, such that Bresson and his style, which is very, it can be described as being very minimal, very stark, very, let's say, refined, very rigid even. I would say there's also an element of stillness, but that also brings attention to the fact that there is much going on in the space between us, as much as there is in the individuals themselves. And I think when we focus on the space between us, I think that can be something that can be linked in cinematic visual terms anyway to this broad notion of something which might be called a kind of connection that exists between human beings. And sometimes people consider these connections that exist between human beings something akin to a kind of movement towards spirituality, or something that exists outside of us. And I think Bresson deals with that very much in terms of faith and crises in faith, and also dealing with these crises in faith, or crisis in faith, and then trying to figure out exactly what it is about the frame that transcends it almost to a higher, almost spiritual level. And so I think that is at the essence, what I see anyway, in terms of Bresson and his sort of style, if you will. And so that's what makes it, I think, very singular and noticeable, to borrow the words from your question. Again, I apologize if my explanation here is a little bit rough around the edges, so, but I hope you can understand. But a great question. Number 2, do you lean favorably towards any particular style of dialogue? Of course, certain styles are suited to different genres, but is there any you are particularly fond of, be it invisible dialogue, or that doesn't show itself off and aims more for an appropriation of realism? One-liner type dialogue, Leone, that tends to have some punchline to it, on 3 men or 3 bullets, right? Or witty type dialogue where a character always seems to have the best comeback. Okay, it's a very, again, very multifaceted, excellent question, my friend. And I think the answer is it depends. I think there is no one brand of dialogue that I would say I prefer over others. It really depends on how it's used in the particular film and the context, and how effective it is, and whether it's meant to call attention to itself or whether it's meant to be more invisible, and if so, how well it's written, how natural does it sound, how well the flow goes, how the interaction between characters that are speaking, and all these variables, of course. And so I must say that, of course, there are many different types of dialogue, many different ways that films employ different methods of conveying information, including how to convey information via dialogue, whether that information be actual narrative, plot-driven information in terms of what's actually being revealed in the dialogue, or certain nuances or delivery methods that could indicate something or things about the character that is speaking the dialogue, right? Or maybe some aspect of the persons that are listening to the dialogue, and that sort of thing. And so I think it really depends. Right, I think, again, it depends on how well it's used in the film and how natural it feels, I suppose. And number 3, in your Blu-ray reviews, you often seem quite interested in the included video essay supplements. Do you often read much film criticism theory aside from this? If so, what are some of your favorite books of film criticism theory? I am currently reading The American Cinema by Andrew Harris, and I really want to read the book Hitchcock by François Truffaut. Thank you, Daisuke. I hope my questions will be valuable for your Q&A and may incite quality discussion. Well, thank you very much for your excellent third question, and the other questions, of course. Really well done. I'm very impressed. Thank you so much for this. And you ask about reading. Yes, so I did quite a bit of reading of film criticism and film theory, more when I was a student than anything else, because I did study, or I did take a number of classes in film studies. And during those occasions, I took intro to film studies and also different specific film studies courses. And during that period, I studied essentially the film studies classics, if you will, the standard syllabus for film studies reading. And then along the way, I would come across more specific works. And so things, especially at that time, that I really was drawn to were, for example, maybe the writings of, just to give examples here, Robin Wood, for example, Dudley Andrew as well. And actually, I'm a big admirer of Dudley Andrew. I actually had the great fortune of meeting him in person. I was a student and he was a professor. I never took any of his classes, unfortunately, but I met him on a number of occasions, and he's sure to not remember me now, of course. Why would he remember me? But I certainly remember meeting him, and it was a really great meeting. And he is just as well-mannered and well-spoken in person as he is on the printed page. And so it's really great. And there are many others, of course. So anyway, thank you so much for your great questions, and I hope you are well. Next is Noah Plunkard. So hello, Noah. I hope you're well. Might have already been asked, but what titles would you like to see join the Criterion Collection? So yes, so I have mentioned a number of titles already in past videos, so if you want to take a look, you're more than welcome to do so. But of course, there are many others. I mean, there are so many that I could mention there's so many I could mention that unfortunately are not yet in the Criterion Collection. I suppose the one that comes to mind, I might have mentioned it before, but I think Citizen Kane would be really great to see in the Criterion Collection. Citizen Kane and King Kong, and particularly because of their connections as Criterion Collection Laserdiscs. Citizen Kane it's considered Criterion Collection Laserdisc spine number 1, and King Kong is considered Criterion Collection Laserdisc spine number 2. So there's there's quite a fundamental fundamental significance that these two titles have in the history of the Criterion Collection. And they were, in other words, they were the Laserdiscs. They were among the first Laserdiscs ever to be released by the Criterion Collection. And so there is, and not to mention, of course, the fact that their stature as examples of cinema, I think also would be really fitting for the Criterion Collection. I know a lot of people would be really excited to see those and what Criterion today would do with releases like that. But those are some other examples, I suppose, that come to mind. Again, just two of maybe millions and millions of possibilities, but a great question as always. Again, it's always exciting to consider what Criterion might be currently planning up its sleeve right now. So we'll have to wait until the next announcement from them. But thank you very much, Noah, for your great question. I really appreciate it. Okay, next we have a question from Austin Mathews. Hello, Austin. And your question is, what are the film scenes always on your mind? Which ones do you revisit over and over again? That's a really, really good question. I guess I'll try to be as ambiguous as possible because I don't necessarily want to spoil anything. But again, trying to be as ambiguous as possible. I think scenes from the film Vertigo are scenes that I visit quite often, and maybe not necessarily the memorable scenes, although there are many memorable famous scenes in that, but I'm talking more about the quiet scenes. There's a particular piece of music on the soundtrack, which is, I think, given the title By the Fireside, and that piece of music is used in a scene fairly early in the film where the main characters essentially meet for the first time, and there's a fireside, and there's James Stewart, who is very dashing and handsome, and then Kim Novak, who emerges into the room in a very slow, deliberate, mysterious way. She emerges she enters the scene almost like a lost goddess or something. It's really a sight to behold, and the music is laid on ever so gently and sensitively, and just enough to slowly build what is this really potent and quite powerful romantic tension between these two lost souls or wanderers, people who just wander about. And that is one of the scenes that I always cling to whenever I think of that film, and it's the scene that I always refer to whenever I recall just how much I admire and love that film, Vertigo. So I think that's an example of a scene that I visit in my mind over and over again. And in fact, it's interesting too, whenever I put in the disc for Vertigo, not all the time, but most of the time, I will just skip to that scene and then watch it and experience it because I just love it so. And then it'll get me into a certain mood or a frame of mind, and I'll be ready to watch the film Vertigo. I mean, I've seen it so many times I've lost count, but that's a scene that I really, really enjoy, very much so. Yes. There are many other examples, but I'll leave it at that example if you don't mind. And anyway, thank you very much, Austin, for your really great question. I really appreciate it. Next is, Neon Knights. Hello, Neon Knights, my dear friend. I hope you're doing well. It's nice to hear from you. And number one, what was your greatest Laserdisc, DVD, or Blu-ray find in the wild? Okay, that's a good question. And in the wild, you have in quotation marks, so you're meaning something that I found by chance in the store or something like that. And I think the one for me was probably here in Tokyo. It was in a sort of specialty Blu-ray movie store here in Tokyo, and they sold Blu-rays, Japanese Blu-rays, but also import Blu-rays, including some used Criterions. And so there's a shelf with used Criterions. Not a lot, maybe not that big a shelf, maybe about the size of maybe two of these shelves maximum, maybe a little bit more, but not that many. But once in a while, before this whole world crisis hit Japan, I would go out to the area, not frequently, but once in a while, maybe once a month, maybe a little bit less. Whatever I would be in the area, I'd just stop by the store and see what they had to offer, because there would always be a slightly different selection. And one day, I just happened in the store, and I noticed a really a copy of the Blu-ray, Criterion Blu-ray of The Man Who Fell to Earth. And by this time, the Blu-ray had since fallen out of print and became a title that is, at least at the time, was fetching quite a bit of money on the used market. Really one of the more expensive titles in the Criterion OOP marketplace. And so I think I was able to find that in this Japanese store for about 25 or 30 US dollars. It was in Japanese yen, but you could exchange it at the current exchange rate at the time would be approximately 25, 30 US dollars. And it was in great condition, and the booklet was there, and the disc had no scratches. It played perfectly, and it was really wonderful. I had the title already at the time, in fact, but I was just looking at this and I thought, I guess I'm never going to see this in this condition at this price in the wild ever again. And so I decided to purchase it right there and then. So I still have it. So I have that's another copy of the Criterion Blu-ray of The Man Who Fell to Earth. So that was really great. And I've mentioned this before on another Q&A, but I do know a friend of mine who also lives in Tokyo, who's also into the Criterion collection, who did find in the wild the Criterion Blu-ray of Chungking Express, and I think it was the Digipack, and so that was also really great. Around the same price, around 20 US dollars, he said. And so that was really great. That's still one that, even despite these rumors that we might get a huge box set of the films, including Chungking Express, it might come back to the Criterion collection. Even so, at present, it is still OOP, and it is still one of the more expensive, or one of the most expensive Criterion OOP titles on the used market. So to find it for $20 is a real bargain. And once in a while in Japan, you'll find these things. I find on sort of Japan or Japanese auction sites, sometimes Criterion titles will be offered, and you'll see OOP titles going for some really low prices. And so not all the time, but once in a while. So those are possible. And let's see, number 2. Are you a great fan of any movie subgenre that you haven't mentioned in your videos? Okay, there are so many subgenres of videos, of films that I haven't mentioned on this channel, unfortunately. And that's due to my own, let's say, ignorance or lack of time or lack of preparation. There are many things I do want to talk about, but I haven't spoken about. I think the one maybe glaring hole in my discussion of this on this channel over the course of these years, I think, has been silent cinema. And I mentioned silent cinema. Of course, I acknowledge that it's very vast, and it's even composed of different genres within that whole classification. So I get that. But I'm talking about the vast sea of silent cinema. I don't think I've spoken about any silent film on this channel, which is a real shame. Again, there are so many films to talk about, so little time. I wish I had more time. I wish there were more hours in the day, my friends, to be able to talk more about these films. But at the moment, I haven't spoken about silent films yet. I'm trying to remedy that, of course. And I'm currently considering the possibility, for example, of doing a couple of silent films for upcoming live streams. I haven't decided yet, but I'd love to do that. But yes, one of these days I need to remedy that. There are a number of silent films that I do want to talk about quite desperately, and so I think, but that's the one big gap in this channel. But I will try to remedy that. But anyway, Neon Nights, my dear friend, thank you so much. And I remember our conversations from the very early days of this channel, and you provided some great questions back then. And so you were talking, right? We were talking about John Carpenter, I think, about Fulci, etc. So so yes, so thank you very much, and it's always good to see you. Thank you once again. Next we have, if I get this pronunciation wrong, I apologize. So ACEVEDO Video Store. Again, I apologize if my pronunciation is incorrect. I'm very sorry about that. But you ask, which lost film would you like to watch but can't due to it being lost? I think there are many. The one that comes to mind immediately, it's not the film itself, but I've mentioned it before, but it would be great to have the the lost footage of the Magnificent Ambersons. That is something that I would, oh gosh, that would be really great. Or it's not necessarily a lost film. Well, actually, I guess it is if you know the backstory. But also there's the filmmaker Ryrie and his film El Sur. And if you know El Sur, you know what I'm talking about. I don't want to mention too much because I don't want to spoil it, but there is a certain element of that film having a kind of it would have been slightly longer, or not slightly, significantly longer than what it is now, which is still a masterpiece, a brilliant level. But there were, it would have been or could have been something that it ended up not being. It became a completely different thing. But that's one that I would, oh gosh, just to think about that too, it almost pains my heart. But again, what we have now is, we are, I guess, fortunate to have what we have now. But those, I think, are just some examples. But thank you very much for that great question. Again, please forgive me for my poor pronunciation. ACEVEDO Video Store. Anyway, thank you so much, and I hope you are well. Next is a Raven Q 222. So my dear friends, how are you doing? I hope you're well. Hello, Daisuke. If you are comfortable taking personal questions, I'd like to ask about your background. You have mentioned watching British television growing up, but your accent sounds very American to me. If it's not too personal, could you share where you grew up? Also, what is your opinion of the films of Jim Jarmusch? I'd like to hear your thoughts on his work. Okay, great. So I'll mention Jarmusch first. I'm a great admirer of his work. I've spoken a little bit about his works. I think during the early days, what was I doing? What was I doing? Like 5 by Criterion. Anyone remember those that I was doing? I don't do those anymore, but I think in one of those episodes that I did, I think I mentioned, oh gosh, my memory's not so good, so I don't remember exactly what I did with every single video I've done here, but I think I mentioned, maybe it was Mystery Train, I think. But again, those were just very, very brief summations rather than going into any deep detail of the films. But yes, Jarmusch films I'm a great admirer of his work and the way that he tells stories and the way he portrays his characters and gives the characters room to breathe, and the musical palette that he provides, and the way that his viewpoint is a little bit off of center, but it's still just as sincere, just as appropriate, and just as honest and poetic and pure. I really admire his work. I actually saw him in real life once in a small bookstore in New York, just off of the campus, the main campus of New York University. And he was a very tall guy, as far as I remember. Maybe I'm not remembering very well, but it was obviously him, and he was in this small bookstore, and it was. I should have said something, but I knew it was him immediately, but I just froze, and unfortunately I didn't go up to him and say hello, or just I'm admiring of his works or anything like that. But anyway, yes, so that's Jarmusch. I tried to talk about his works more. Incidentally, I haven't. It's not a Jarmusch film per se, but I am revisiting the Criterion DV of Fishing with John, and of course we know that Jarmusch features quite prominently in one of those episodes, and so yes, I should try to talk about his works more prominently here on this channel. I'll see what I can do. And then for your first question, you asked me, if it's not too personal, could you share where you grew up? So yeah, no, I don't mind at all. So I've mentioned a little bit about my personal background in other videos, in other Q&A videos. But I would say that, let's see, so I was born in Japan. So that means that under citizenship law or immigration law, or the classification of law that is relevant to that particular aspect of one's citizenship. So I am a Japanese citizen by birth, and I'm not a citizen of any other country. So I'm not a Japanese American, but I am 100% Japanese based off of my birth. But when I was quite young, around 2 years old, due to my father's work, and I'm an only child. My mother, my father, and I, when I was again just a little baby, moved to the east coast of the U.S. First we lived, I don't remember it, but based off of what my parents told me, we first lived in, I think, Westchester, New York, that area. And then we then moved to Connecticut, and so we lived in Connecticut. And so I think that's the time that my father was commuting to New York, and so he took, what was it, the Metro North, right? It was the Metro North train, and we lived near, it wasn't New Canaan, Connecticut, but we lived near New Canaan, Connecticut. And if you know the film, The Ice Storm, the Ice Storm, the Ang Lee film, The Ice Storm, and the town New Canaan, Connecticut, is the setting of the film, and in fact, many of the locations that are used in that film are locations that I remember, because I remember visiting New Canaan quite a number of times, actually, because we not only did we have friends, that I had friends who lived in New Canaan, but also there was a really good, there were some good restaurants that my family would go to in Connecticut. And I actually remember, I want to say that it was there was a theater in New Canaan, Connecticut, where, oh gosh, where we saw maybe it was we saw a Batman movie, I think it was. Maybe I'm not remembering correctly, but I want to say that it was in a theater in New Canaan where we saw a Batman movie, maybe. But I want to say it's probably Batman Returns, but again, my memory is pretty hazy about that. What was that? So yes, let's see, and there was also a park in New Canaan, which I don't know if it's still there anymore, because I haven't been there since, but the name of the park was Waverly Park. If anyone who knows that area knows Waverly Park, please let me know. But that was a really wide, expansive park, and it was really wonderful. And I think those are scenes where I think we see young Christina Ricci walking with her bicycle through the woods. And I think part of those scenes were shot actually in or around Waverly Park, I think. And so I do recognize some of those places, and so that was pretty interesting. But again, I didn't live in New Canaan, and my high school was in Stamford, Connecticut, and it was a very small school, and it was the teachers were very friendly, and the students were very friendly, and in fact, I actually someone who I went to school with in high school actually sort of caught up with me and contacted me last year after, I think, having seen one of my YouTube videos or something. And so so there are still some connections to be had with my high school past, I suppose. So that's very interesting. So so that was in Stanford, and then I went to university also in the United States. But this is all to say that I spent a good majority of my childhood in the United States, with a little bit of, I would say, a 3 to 4 year block in there in the late 80s up to, let's say, the early 90s in the United Kingdom. And so that would be when I was maybe about 6 or 7, I think. I forget exactly when, but it was around that time. And so by the time we moved to the UK in Surrey, and we lived in Guildford and then in Woking, which is in the UK, Surrey. By the time we moved there, I think I was already speaking, and so I'd grown up with this American accent whenever I spoke English, and so I think that's where the American accent comes in. But I do remember. I mean, my British English is not so good, and of course I don't have a British accent of any kind, but I do remember that was a great learning experience in terms of how different the British English and American English was. I was a kid, but I remember it took me a little while to get used to the rhythms and the cadences as well as the meanings. And I remember being so fascinated with the word cuppa. What I was thinking was, someone was saying, let's have a cuppa or something. I heard someone say, let's have a cuppa, and I thought, what is a cuppa? I was like, what is a cuppa? What could this be? It sounds so cool, but I think, oh gosh, what is a cuppa? I never really figured it out until a little bit later. And oh, that's really interesting. I like how that's used. And I was always fascinated with tea time. It's tea time. And I always thought, well, when exactly is tea time? Is there a specific time for tea time? I don't know. Is it at this time or that time? And I asked my mom, when is that? What time exactly does tea time start and when does it end? And she didn't know either. And so that was also very fascinating. I was really quite taken with that. And what was the other one? Oh yes, it was crisps. I was always fascinated with the English word crisps, because of course growing up in the States I was used to the word chips, but then when I got there and I used chips, that led to a different meaning altogether. And so I always thought that was really quite fascinating. And there are many other examples like that, but well, anyway, I do have some other comments about that in other Q&As, so if you wanted to take a look at those, you're welcome to do so. So that's kind of my background in terms of why I have my American accented English the way it is. So anyway, thank you very much for your question. Let's see. Next is Firefly2193. Hello, my friend. And you say, hi, Daisuke. Love your channel. My two-part question. Number one, what is your TV sound setup like? Do you have a 4K TV? What size and what sound do you use? TV speakers, external stereo speakers, sound bar, surround sound setup, headphones, etc. Okay, and two. Well, let me start with there. So I've spoken about my approach to presenting my TV setup on YouTube. So at the moment, I haven't made any video about that. And I might do something in the future, but at the moment I don't have a video like that. And my setup is very, very simple. I don't have any special sound setup here because unfortunately, I can't have anything too loud because I can't disturb my neighbors. And so if we had too much of a sound system, I think that would mean disturbing the neighbors, and I can't have that, and that would be not good for our relationships with our neighbors. And so we can't have any loud sound system. And so I'll have very simple audio setups, or I'll just use headphones where necessary. Also because I do watch a lot of films at night when my family's asleep, to take into consideration films that I don't want to show my kids because of the content. And so when they're asleep and everything is quiet, that's when I'll do a lot of my film watching, which means that I have to make sure that the volume is very low, or I'm using headphones so they won't hear. And as far as 4K TVs are concerned, I was actually in the neighborhood of thinking about getting a 4K TV. I thought now would be a good time. And our family was thinking about maybe taking the plunge earlier this year, but then unfortunately, the situation with this world crisis hit the world, including Japan. And so at the moment, my family, my wife and I are now considering that we should perhaps wait. We shouldn't do any spending on any new TVs or anything like that until we can be sure that after this crisis is behind us, we can still be sure that we have enough saved up just in case something bad were to happen and we would need to rely on some kind of savings. And so we just want to be sure, just in case, that we're not spending money on let's say a TV at the moment when we already have. It's not a 4K TV, but we do have very decent TVs that we are relying on. So once this whole crisis is behind us, and once everything has calmed down to the extent that we can start spending a little bit more consumable income, then maybe our family will purchase a 4K TV. Hopefully, maybe by the end of this year. I'm not sure. But again, it really depends on when this crisis is averted, how it's averted, and whether or not, even at the end of it, we might need to rely on our savings. And so, again, that's one of the worrying things about this particular situation, of course, is that it's always I'm of the position that it's probably better just to, in my position anyway, just to be safe than sorry. And so we're just trying to keep our spending to a minimum. And so that also means, of course, waiting for a 4K TV purchase until well in advance from now. So. But anyway, thank you very much for that. And number 2, how important is the technical aspect of movies to you? Do you care about 4K quality restorations, HD versus DVD, the quality of sound mixes, etc., or is this relatively unimportant to you? Thanks. I would say it's not unimportant to me, but I'll be perfectly honest. It's something that, how should I put it? I don't. Oh, well, okay, let me take a step back and say that I love the times that we are living in. I really do. Not just in terms of things that are available that maybe weren't necessarily available before, but also the quality in which they're being made available. I mean, we're getting such great quality of presentation, which is something to be so grateful for, and I am, especially when I remember the times I grew up, in VHS days, etc. But with that in mind, my friends, I always have to keep in mind the fact that I'm how should I put it? The one thing that I'm most concerned about is not necessarily the quality of presentation, which I think is always, the quality of things now is really quite stellar and so impressive. But the thing I'm always concerned about is where there are certain substantive changes made to a particular release, such that a new release with changes that didn't exist in any previous release of the same film thus becomes the norm for that particular film. For example, the film, I spoke about this film just a few days ago in the Film Club live stream, which is the film Heat, Michael Mann's Heat. Now, as some of you may know, this film has been released recently in a beautiful, stunning looking Blu-ray and more, and so it's called the Director's Definitive Edition, I think. But the thing about that edition, of course, is that there are a number of changes that are made, not just in terms of the look, in terms of the Blu-ray video quality presentation, but also in terms of the content. And there's no indication on the back of the tin, oh, these particular changes have been made, etc. There's nothing that indicates that. And so that always, while it doesn't worry me so much, I always have to be careful because that says to me that the film is slightly different than what I would otherwise be used to based off of what I've seen in the theater with that film, and then in subsequent VHS releases, and then the early DVD, etc. And so what that means to me is that the newest releases, while they can be really great and stellar quality-wise, are not always necessarily the only ones to have. Yeah, that's one thing. And another thing, too, is there is also something to be said, at least for me in my own personal experience, there is something to be said for watching a film in a kind of grainy, almost beat-up quality that adds to a certain mystique about it, or adds an interesting dimension to it. Don't get me wrong, of course. There is so much value and worth in seeing the crisp cleanness of a picture, in particular when the filmmaker, the director, or the cinematographer, or whoever approves it and declares that this is the way it was meant to be seen. That very oft-used phrase, but it's oft-used because it says so much, of course, right? And I get that. I totally get that. But there's also something to be said about seeing something rough, seeing something with a little bit of a beaten up print, seeing something with some rough edges showing, seeing something that was shown on a VHS tape with a little bit of the static still there, and that's, there's something of a charm for me anyway in watching a film even now in that kind of condition, because that's how I grew up watching these films to begin with, and that means that now when I watch films, I tend to prefer let's say a soundtrack that isn't necessarily all encompassing. I'll tend, if there's a choice, especially with a classic film, with a sort of a post subsequent post ex post facto surround soundtrack or something like that. I always prefer the more the original soundtrack mix, etc. And so I always go with that, and even I won't necessarily mind having, let's say, an inferior release of a film, because I can still watch it and still enjoy it based off of my own experiences growing up with a film, for example. And so this is all to say that while I, on the one hand, I really am so happy that I'm living in these times that we live in, I also appreciate the fact that there are a number of issues, not always, but there are some issues that do exist with the most recent releases. And that means that sometimes, not always, but sometimes there are instances where an earlier release will be, for me anyway, the more preferable version, depending on my mood at the time. So I hope that answers the question. But anyway, really great questions. So thank you very much for taking the time to ask them. Let's see. Next is Eric Navarro, our dear friend. I have 3 questions. Number 1. Do you log the films you own digitally, like a spreadsheet or a tracking app? So the answer to this question is no, I don't do that. I do write down a little bit that's not like a diary, but a little notebook. But I admit I don't do this for every single thing that I've seen. I try to be as current as possible with that, but I don't have any digital log or any kind of digital diary of that sort of thing. I know people use Letterboxd for that, but I've mentioned before that I'm not so good with apps and using online apps like that. Again, it's just something that I'm not used to, and so no, not really. So I have to rely kind of on what I've written down, but also kind of also on my memory. Which might not necessarily be a good thing because my memory is not so good, especially lately. Let's see, number 2, I keep hearing streaming is taking over and the purchase of physical media is waning. Brick and mortar stores are constantly consolidating their DVD and Blu-ray sections. As an avid Blu-ray collector, this really worries me. Do you think the end is near for movies distributed on physical media? I can't say. I really don't know. I, of course, have to remain realistic and say that physical media, DVD and Blu-ray, could end very soon. There still could be some life in it. Of course, I'd love to see it continue on for as long as possible. Of course. But I have to remain realistic, and so even if the Blu-ray, DVD Blu-ray market were to end, there would still be the aftermarket, there would still be the used market, and so that would still be in existence, maybe along the same lines as VHS and Laserdisc is today, especially as time progresses, of course. And also, we should also keep in mind that we'll see how streaming adapts. I can see how streaming might adapt in order to compete with physical media, and maybe that way of adapting might make streaming services even more, let's say, palatable for those who are strictly in the physical media camp. And so I can see that happening. So I can see perhaps my way of consumption would shift towards streaming services. I mean, I could see that happening. That could be a reasonable possibility. Of course, it depends on the price. It depends on what's made available and all this stuff. But I could see that happening. Although there are a number of issues that will be brought up in terms of versions that are being made available, time windows of availability and all this stuff, which I am not used to, and those are some of the reasons why I prefer physical media over stream. But that's, again, my own personal preference and predilection. And again, that's nothing against streaming, but it's just an expression of my own preferences. But even with those preferences, I do acknowledge the fact that physical media could go away as soon as the next few years. I don't know. Hopefully, it will be longer, but I can't deny the possibility, right? And so, I will try to be as flexible and as malleable as possible. But also keeping in mind exactly what will be offered and how I can still maintain Blu-ray or DVD or physical media appreciation. Of course, those discs do exist in the world, so they're not going anywhere. It won't be like the fact that they'll just disappear. Just be that the stream of product or the production will come to a halt, and so nothing new will be produced. So that's the issue. But does it worry me? I'm not sure if I would use the word worry. I would say that while I'm going to remain as realistic as possible, I hope that this current situation, as far as a healthy Blu-ray market or DVD market, continues as long as possible. I hope it continues as long as possible. And number 3, what is your feeling on people talking while watching movies? Oh, okay. So you're talking about like if you go to the theater and maybe someone behind you or someone near you is talking with someone, or maybe talking at the screen or something like that, or maybe even at home. When I was younger, when I was in my teenage years and then my early to mid 20s, and I was really exploring cinema for the first time, I was really going to the movie theaters more than I am now. I was very, very sensitive to that, and I found it very irritating and annoying if there was any kind of noise like that, people talking in the theater, and I could hear it, and I would feel very just distracted. But now I find I don't mind it at all. I think because of a number of things. First is because here in Japan, there is a real sense of etiquette whenever one goes to the movie theater. There's no talking. No one talks during the movie theater, at least in any of the shows that I went to. And there's always a sense of even people laughing out loud is pretty rare. It does happen, of course, but it's still quite, let's say, subdued. It's not as loud as maybe theaters in the U.S. that I went to. And so I'm used to that, and so perhaps that means that I get that I have the luxury of that already, and so maybe I'm taking it for granted, perhaps. But even when I'm home and when I'm watching a film, let's say maybe a fairly serious film, but still age appropriate with the family. If people are talking during that, I don't mind that at all. Or even maybe when I'm watching a film with a friend or anything and someone whispers something to me, I don't mind that at all. I try to, if I have to whisper something back, I'll try to be as quiet as possible, or I'll try to avoid talking because I don't want to disturb anyone else. But if I really have to respond, I'll try to be as quiet as possible. But I don't necessarily mind that. But I won't myself talk because I understand how sensitive people are. I think rightly so. I've heard some pretty I've stories about people going to the movie theater and other people there having their cell phone on, and I can't even imagine that because I've never seen that here in Japan. I guess I've been either very fortunate or what. I mean, people walk in front of you because they have to get to their seat or something like that. But that's a normal thing. Or people are eating, but people eat popcorn or they have their soda or drink of choice, and I don't mind that at all. But it also depends on the nature of the film itself. If it's a film that really creates this atmosphere that calls for talking to the screen, I think the more the merrier, of course. But I guess it really depends. So I should say that maybe to answer your question, I don't mind, but let me put it this way. I don't know if I've really been tested lately in the theater. Maybe if I were in that situation now, I would have to see what my reaction would be. So Yeah. So anyway, thank you very much for your great questions, and I hope you're well, my friend. Let's see. Next is NipTuck117. So, hello, my friend. I have two for you, if that's okay. That's perfectly fine. Number one, I recently noticed your interest in the James Bond series. Do you have any favorites and why? Okay, so I guess I could mention a few. I do like many of them, and for different reasons. I grew up. I was born in 1979, and so I grew up in the 80s. And so the first films I remember were films like A View to a Kill and The Living Daylights. And so I'm a really big fan of those two films. I think partially because I grew up with them, but also I'm very fond of them. I'm fond of Timothy Dalton's approach to James Bond. I'm very, very fond of Roger Moore's approach to James Bond. And I do know that A View to a Kill is one of the films that gets a lot of, let's say, criticism, perhaps. But I still, let's say, flaws and all, I still love that film. And I just remember just experiencing it as a kid. And I just get that feeling again whenever I watch A View to a Kill. And I do remember also growing up during the the late 80s, and I was in the UK at the time, and there would be periodically on TV, I forget what it was exactly, was it LWT, London Weekend Television? I think it was, they would have these James Bond films that they'd show on TV on a fairly regular basis, and so I would always try to record them, as many of them as I could, on our VCR. And so I recorded them and I watched them over and over again and I tried to record them such that I could just cut out all the, those of you who remember VCRs, I don't know if you were like this, but not always, but sometimes I'd always try to stop the recording when the adverts came on or the commercials came on, and then start again when the commercials stopped. And so that's what I'd always try to do. Not all the time, but sometimes, because I was at the time, I didn't really like to have the interruptions of the adverts, commercials. Now, of course, I think, oh gosh, I wish I still had those tapes and I could watch them with the commercials there, just to relive that time, of course, just to live a sort of a blast from the past, of course. But so watching the James Bond films on TV was also a great thing. Of course, they were edited for television sometimes, and so you weren't really getting the full experience. But still, as a kid growing up, watching all these films essentially without ever having to pay for going to the movie theaters, it was really great. And especially at that time, we didn't have all these Blu-rays that we have now, of course. But so I watched so many, and I remember the ones that I watched. I loved Moonraker. As a kid, watching Moonraker, gosh, that was really great. Again, I know that's one that's maybe not for everyone, but as a kid growing up, watching Moonraker is so much fun, so that even now when I watch it, I feel like a kid again. And I also remember you watch films and sometimes you don't like them at a certain age, but then when you get into your teenage years or something, you get a little bit older, or you feel differently about certain types of Bond films because they're so different. So I remember feeling when I was really, really young, not necessarily getting into the films like Diamonds Are Forever or The Man with the Golden Gun, but now I really admire those films, and as James Bond film entertainments, of course. Diamonds Are Forever. That's one that I think that's such a clever, witty film. Alimentary, Dr. Leiter. And so, and what else? Oh yes, and in terms of Bonds, of course, I'm very, very fond of Connery's era. I'm very, very fond of Roger Moore's era. I love On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I love Timothy Dalton. And in particular, I'm a great admirer, as I say, of The Living Daylights. As I said, I was growing up, and I had a huge I have a huge crush on Mariam Dabo and Cara Malovi. And so whenever I watched The Living Daylights, I just remember how much of a crush I had, and it's also a very romantic Bond film, and the John Barry score is so beautiful. And I do remember the time also that those soundtracks too were, at the time, the Living Daylights soundtrack was such a hard soundtrack to find. They didn't release the reissued soundtrack yet. The same was true for Octopussy and For Your Eyes Only. But then when they issued those reissues on these beautiful deluxe CDs or whatever they were, I was so over the moon. I couldn't tell you. Especially the Living Daylights. As soon as I got my hands on that soundtrack, I was over the moon. I was listening to that constantly. I couldn't believe how lucky I was to be able to finally get the soundtrack of The Living Daylights. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I've mentioned it before, but the Pretenders, Where Has Everybody Gone? And If There Was a Man. Oh, my goodness. My goodness, that's great. I think, I want to say that The Living Daylights was, 1987, right? And so I think I was a kid at the time, and I forget exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in Europe. And I'd mentioned in a Q&A that my parents really loved to travel, and so we would take family trips to certain places, sometimes in Europe. And I remember we were taking a trip abroad. I forget exactly where, but it was in a European country, and we arrived at whatever the hotel was, and I think it was a kind of a resort, maybe an enclosed resort. So there was a beach front where the hotel was, and so you could walk, and just a few yards away you could go to the beachfront or the pool or wherever. And so my parents, and there wasn't any tour or anything, so it was just a kind of relaxation vacation as far as I recall. And I remember, though, it was beautiful climate and all that, and kind of remembering back. I don't remember specifically where it was, but those are the hazy, foggy memories that I have of it. But I do remember this, that I was so excited, not because of the weather and the pool and the swimming. I was more excited about the fact that the hotel had on its TV menu, TV programming, it had the film The Living Daylights. And so I was so excited. My parents were saying, let's go out. And I said, no. I want to stay in the hotel and watch The Living Daylights. And so they let me. They said, okay, they really wanted to go out, I suppose, and just enjoy the sun. And so I guess I was a stubborn kid. And so I decided I'm going to stay in the hotel and just watch The Living Daylights. That's what I did. And I just stayed in the hotel. And I remember being by myself and watching The Living Daylights. And I suppose they had me stay there and not go out. But I said, I'll stay here and watch The Living Daylights, and I did. And I remember that was how I watched The Living Daylights for the first time, was in this hotel room in some European country while my parents were enjoying the sunshine. I was in the room because I wanted to see The Living Daylights so much, and it was great. And ever since then, my love for The Living Daylights has not at all weakened. So anyway, and not to mention, of course, other films. Of course, I didn't even mention On Her Majesty's Secret Service as much as I would, and maybe I'll try to save my comments just in case the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service is selected for a future live stream, of course. But oh gosh, what a film to talk about. So. There's so many. I didn't even mention other films too, like Live and Let Die. I did mention that's a peculiar one, I must admit. That's one that I have. I find that I go back and forth on, to be perfectly honest. But I like its overall spirit. And I didn't even mention The Spy Who Loved Me as well, which I think is stellar stuff. Octopussy, I didn't mention that one too, but I really enjoy that one. I find that, the thing about Octopussy, which I never really understood, to be perfectly honest, and I'll try to be as vague as possible, but a lot of people, not a lot, but I know some people who tended to describe Octopussy as being a kind of like absurd, like comedy or something like that, or maybe they use Octopussy as an example of the Roger Moore era being campy or light in tone. And I never understood. I could understand it if they used the examples of Moonraker or even A View to a Kill in that kind of description of the Roger Moore era. But whenever someone used that description and used Octopussy as an example, to be perfectly honest, I never really understood that, because Octopussy is actually a very frightening film. There are certain, kind of light elements, of course, but it's pretty dark and quite frightening, especially for a little kid. And there's things with clown makeup and all this stuff. But that stuff too is actually presented in a very suspenseful and frightening way. And so I always thought that Octopussy, at least I'm thinking about how I watched it growing up as a kid, because I was really scared of a lot of scenes in Octopussy. And so I thought that. I always thought that it was less of the campiness of the Roger Moore era and more of the sort of seriousness. It felt like a nice continuation, if you will, from the earlier film, For Your Eyes Only. And I didn't even mention For Your Eyes Only. Gosh, I didn't. And License to Kill, I didn't even mention. And so I remember also the gap, the years in between License to Kill and a GoldenEye. And so that was a long time. That was really, I lived through that. And I remember when GoldenEye came out, and I saw it in the theater. So I was probably a little bit older. So I know for a lot of people who are talking about James Bond films now, I know for a lot of people GoldenEye was their James Bond film. So I think I maybe missed out on that by a few years. So I'm of a slightly older generation than those who consider GoldenEye their Bond film. But still, I understand where they're coming from, because I do understand so many elements of the film that really clicked for a lot of people. But my Bond was always, as I say, I grew up around the time of A View to a Kill and The Living Daylight. So those are films that I hold so near and dear to my heart. With the films also, and then going back, and then I know my parents were such fans of Sean Connery's Bond, and You Only Live Twice, and I mentioned Diamonds Are Forever, but they were really big fans of From Russia with Love and Goldfinger and Thunderball. And I always remember that I was so confused with Thunderball, because, as you know, there are all these different versions of Thunderball. The soundtrack changes and the music cues change a little bit depending on what version you're watching. And so I was always so confused, because sometimes I remember seeing one version and then maybe later I'd watch the film again but not know it was actually a slightly different altered version. I'd always wonder what's going on. It feels a little bit different, but I never could get a sense of what it was. And this was when I was a kid growing up, I suppose. But that was also a very interesting time. But I must say also that while I'm a big fan of Daniel Craig run, my favorite film in the Daniel Craig series is actually Casino Royale. I really love that film very much. I'm not sure where I fall yet with his particular the later films, but I think that film was just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I was so happy when that film came out, and but anyway, I'm so sorry. I think I've just spoken more than I really should have. But anyway, that's your first question, I think, NipTuck117. So your second question is, what are some general tips you'd give to have an even deeper knowledge and appreciation of filmmaking, directing, editing, themes, etc. while watching films? Oh gosh. Your discussions are always so in-depth and expert level in your knowledge. It's an incredible thing to watch. Well, gosh, that is quite the compliment. Well, thank you very much for that. That is really very kind of you. Oh, gosh, I don't know what to say. General tips to, oh God, I don't even know. Deeper knowledge, and I don't know if, my view is not, I don't have any deep knowledge about it, I guess, or anything like that. I'm not a filmmaker. I don't have any deep technical knowledge background. I'm not an engineer or anything like that, and I'm not a cinematographer. And I'm not an editor, so I don't I just know basically what I've seen, and I guess there's that. So it's really hard for me to say. And plus, I'm not that. Yeah, gosh, I don't really consider myself to be giving that many deep comments, if at all. I don't think my knowledge is where it should be. I always try to increase my knowledge, but I always fail every time. So your comment is actually, I'm very touched by it. So thank you very much for this. But maybe if I could explain exactly how I watch a film. It's not the right way, and I don't know if it's the best way if it bears any fruit, but I can let you know that when I watch a film, I suppose what I'm looking for, what I always try to look for, is a kind of hook, or a number of hooks. And what I mean by this is I always try to find something that I latch onto, that I can say that maybe on a personal, quirky level, I like the way that I feel whenever I watch this particular edit take place. Or there's a little bit of dialogue that just rings in my ear, such that I want to remember it and recall it next time. Or even on a personal level, especially when I was a kid growing up, or when I was a teenager, or maybe in college, I'd always think, oh gosh, wouldn't it be so cool if I could say something similar? If there was a young woman that I fancied or something, wouldn't it be so cool if I was able to get the exact right timing down to say this line that I could then say to this young woman to try to impress her or something like that. And it would always fail in real life, of course, but I would always have, that would be an example of something where I would try to think of something about the film that really moved me, or was so memorable to me. It could be a line of dialogue, it could be a feeling, it could be a walk, it could be a little gesture of the body, or something like that. Or it could be the way that the music flowed in at the right moment, making it just right, something like that. It's the details, I think, that really count, really, really count. And, how should I put it? I understand the way in which people talk about films, especially in today's age. I completely get it. And people also have to be sensitive to the fact that spoilers must be avoided unless it's a spoiler discussion and all that. So I get that. And so there is a time and place for talking about a film on a very general, vague, ambiguous level. But I always find that talking about films with those details in mind, I think, make the conversation a lot more fun and a lot more interesting for me. And it's also good. I always love to see people talking about specifics of a film, specific things that they like, not generalities, but specific things. And that's what I always. That's also things that I look for as a viewer, or as a reader of someone else's review, or a viewer of someone else's YouTube video review of a film. I always see how that particular person relies on specifics, what he or she chooses as examples of little elements of the film that they like. I like this particular element. I remember particularly where this person said X, Y, and Z, or something like that. I like that because I can therefore see what the personal choices were involved in order for that person to make the choice that he or she made. And I love that. I can see the excitement in that person's eyes when they're talking about the hooks or the details. And so I always tried to focus in on that. And so if I could give general tips or advice for whatever it's worth, I don't know, it would be this. It would be always try to find the hooks or the little bits of detail that you think mean stuff to you. And this is very important. I think this is very important. Don't worry about picking something that you know is going to get a reaction. In other words, whenever someone is talking about a film, especially a film that is oft discussed in the online community, there tends to be this very natural inclination to want to talk about the stuff that other people have already spoken about. I get that. I feel that all the time. And I do that, I think, a lot of the time. But I also think it's very important, where possible, to try instead to focus in on those hooks and details that you latch onto, rather than getting latched onto certain aspects of the film that you know will get a response because they've already been talked about before. So that's what makes a personal discussion of the film, I think, more fascinating for me as a viewer watching it, and that's what I'm always looking for. And I know I don't get it's very difficult sometimes to try to find what it is about a particular film that makes it interesting to you. I get that it's a very challenging thing, but it doesn't have to be an overly difficult thing. It can be something very subtle and interesting. It's also about, it's the same thing also about when you are talking with someone. When you're talking with someone, you like this person, you're friends with this person, or you are otherwise maybe attracted to this particular person. Why? Because maybe there is a look in the eye, or maybe there is the way that the person is saying a joke, or maybe it's the way that he or she carries himself, or maybe it's the way that he or she walks, or something like that. And I don't mean just on a kind of maybe romantic level, although there's that too, but I just mean on just a general human to human level. There are those little details that really come to the fore, as I like to say, and they are the reasons why we interact in the way that we do. And so I always love those, and I think the same is true for our own interactions with cinema. And so they can be so personal and so random, but even the most random detail is beautiful because you picked it, right? And it says so much about you, and it says also about how you're watching the film. And so I think that is, for me, what I would suggest in terms of advice, in terms of watching films. And I guess also the other thing would be, don't ever forget that life experience is also very, very important. And I think life experience can come in many different forms. So it can be like, it doesn't always have to be these grand experiences, although they could be. But I mean, even the seemingly mundane and simplest experiences of, let's say, waking up and leaving your apartment, going down the stairs, buying a cup of coffee, or something like that. All the routine and the stuff that goes into any kind of experience, being whether it be a small mundane thing or a larger, grander thing. Whatever the case may be, I think life experience is very important. And so I always like to think of films and watch them in some form or another, and how they can reflect upon life experience, at least as far as I can understand. And that's always how I try to see it. And so that always helps, because even if it's a film that is of a subject matter or from a country or a place in the world that I've never been, maybe it's dealing with something that I will never have any personal relationship with. I've never been to this part of the world. I don't know what the ins and outs of this particular process is, or this particular lifestyle is. I have no idea, and I never will. But if I remember my own life experiences and my own feelings as a human being, and I see those on screen, I can look at those and say, oh gosh, I know this, I feel this, I can understand this. And those become more hooks and little things to latch onto. And those little details, I think, really matter. And I always try to look for those. And and I think the really good films too really help in showing those and making it easier for me to try to find those. And so I always suggest to people to try to look for those little details, because they always count. And sometimes you can find them, especially when we're relying on our own life experience and what it is we feel as human beings. And maybe we can spot things that are similar to that in the films that we see. So I suppose that's it as far as that. So again, I'm very sorry for the big mishmash of words there. But I hope that that answers your question to your satisfaction. So thank you very much, NipTuck117. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I will end it there for now. So I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions, but I'll go through these as much as I can. So there will be more Q&A videos in the future. So thank you very much, and until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Once again, my dear friends, thank you, stay well, stay safe, and cheers.